So this very much looks like Peter is auctioning off
I
this
have this
collection.
beautiful selection of gold-plated jewelry that could be yours. If you're the 17th caller, or we have exactly 17 of these left, you need to call now.
Right. The clock's ticking.
Exactly.
We want to share this
Hi,
with you,
my
but only
name
a
is
few lucky people will
Kim
be able.
Macquarie, and I'm happy to have you join me here on my program on QVC today.
Imagine going out to a fine restaurant wearing a pair of these lovely jewels.
Exactly.
So I think that's appropriate.
Hi, my name is Kim Macquarie, and I'm the Director of Community Programming and the Co-Director of the Innovation Labs here at the Dalí. We're happy to welcome you back for another episode of our bi-monthly podcast, Follow the Tangent, Archives, Art, and Anecdotes. In each episode, we take an archive artifact, and we consider how it might teach us more about Dalí's art, Dalí's life, and about the broader world of art history in general. On today's episode, we're going to be looking at a part of Dalí's work that is really not well known by many people. Those who really know Dalí for his paintings might be surprised to know that he also was very interested in the craft of jewelry making. And today we're lucky to have our Curator of Education, Peter Tush, here with us to talk about Dalí's jewelry. Welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Thank you, Kim. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So maybe the first big question is, how did Dalí start making these jewels?
It seems so obvious when you look back at his life because during the Spanish Civil War, Dalí had spent quite a number of months in Rome and traveling through Italy. So he would go between London, Paris, and Italy. But during those 3 years, from about 36 to 39, he started to become really enamored with the Renaissance and Baroque artists and the Italian artists. And one of the things that he became very aware of was the kind of proliferation of art, not just in oil paintings, but in the architecture and all of the kind of decoration and opulence in which the Renaissance lived. You know, the period of discovery and exploration and pure beauty. And I think he really fell under spell not only of Leonardo da Vinci, but also Benvenuto Cellini. And Cellini was an expert jeweler. And at the time that Cellini would create these exquisite jewelry items, it was really about the artistry and the idea more than the preciousness of the stones themselves. And I think Dalí felt that's the way an artist should be. He should surround himself with beautiful things. And Dalí had a real attraction to the idea of luxury. And for him, the most luxurious item is the most useless item. And so jewelry was absolutely the quintessential item, involved with that.
So he has all of these inspirations in the Renaissance and this idea of, the craftsmanship of jewelry. Now, obviously, jewelry craftsmanship is a little bit more complicated than just designing. So is this something that he did by himself, or did he have people that he collaborated with?
Yeah, so there are two phases. There's the earliest phase when Dalí actually was able to take his ideas about jewelry and turn them into a reality was when in 1941 he had the opportunity through his mutual friends Coco Chanel and also Caress Crosby. He was introduced to one of Coco Chanel's jewelry designers, Duke Verdura, Fulco de Verdura. And Verdura is a great, great craftsman and made exquisite jewelry. And so this was the opportunity for Dalí's ideas to become a reality. And so they made 6 pieces together in 1941 that were one-of-a-kind, unique objects, more than pieces to be worn. And they were to be seen, and they were decorative. And Dalí actually did paintings underneath some jewels in 2 of the pieces. So it was also the collaboration between the artist and the jeweler. But this kind of opened the door for Dalí understanding how jewelry making happens and how he could help. So Dalí came up with the design, and then he first worked with Verdura, and then later at the end of the 40s and through the 60s, he worked with a company in New York City called, it was Carlos Alemany's company called Alemany and Company, also with Eric Erdman. So they were exquisite jewelers located at St. Regis, where Dalí lived. And so between these two great jewelers, there's an entire world of Dalí jewelry that's exquisite and really unique.
Now, you mentioned a couple of names there, and I know from my own reading that this period of his career, from the late 40s and the 50s, he's doing a lot of different things. And so, what are some of the things that he's doing, and why is he going so broad in terms of his interests? Because he's doing stuff with Disney, or he's doing things where he's designing all kinds of sets for ballets and all kinds of things. What's going on with him? Why is he doing this?
It seems like Dalí's fallen under the spell during this period of time with not just Richard Wagner, but also Mad King Ludwig of Bavaria. And the idea of bringing the arts into every aspect of your life really matched well with Dalí's idea of creating the more chaos, the better, creating these irrational environments and ways in which you live. And so for him, the idea of an opulent environment, an artistic environment, was essential. And so I think by the mid to late 30s, he starts thinking about things like opera, ballet. He starts designing ballets. By the end of the 30s, he also works on an installation for a pavilion for the World's Fair. And by 1941, this is when he's making the jewelry. He's also writing his autobiography. And when he comes to America, he finds ways of making money, but also doing things other than painting. So he does less painting during his American period from 40 to 48, but he does a lot of advertising. He does a lot of working with fabrics and design, and it seems like this is when the jewelry projects really start to come into fruition. And he's also working with Hitchcock and on Spellbound and Walt Disney on the Destino project, and jewelry figures into both of those in certain ways.
Now, our set of jewels is held here at the museum, and it was a part of the Morse's overall collection, which is what our museum is really made up of. And how did Eleanor Morse come to have her set of Dalí's jewels?
Well, so the Morses get involved with the Dalís right around the time that he's starting to have these jewelry ideas. He's already created the jewelry with Verdura, the 6 pieces. And by the end of the 40s, he's coming to the end of his American period, and the Morses are starting to get more comfortable with him. And by the 50s, this is when Dalí starts to produce the next line of jewelry with Alemany. And this is when Dalí was at the St. Regis Hotel. He would stay every winter there from September through probably January. And so the Morses had opportunities to visit him with some great regularity. And I think they were really captivated by these jewelry ideas that he had. They were seeing these, and they were created as one-of-a-kind objects. So a typical, say, melting watch pin that Dalí would design and then Alemany would create, that would be sold for somewhere like $10,000, $15,000. And the Morses were collecting the oil paintings. That was their primary focus. But I think Eleanor Morse obviously loved these. And Reynolds Morse was intrigued by, these are the master's creations. That would be his perception. So they approached Alemany and Erdman, his partner, and just, they inquired about, could we get a more affordable version or a simpler version of some of these exquisite one-of-a-kind objects. And that's what we have here is a selection of pieces that they were able to purchase for anywhere from about $1,000 to $1,500 that were designed specifically for Eleanor Morse by Alemany and Company, knowing that Dalí would approve of this. So Dalí was aware that they were doing this. There was no conflict. They were not trying to recreate the original. And so we have some really extraordinary examples of more wearable versions of these exquisite one-of-a-kind objects that Dalí was creating.
Now, before we get into taking a closer look at our own jewels, even though perhaps people today are less familiar with Dalí's jewelry work than they are with his paintings, in this time period that you're talking about, there actually is another set of these gems, I guess the actual gems that are owned by Cummins Catherwood.
Right.
And they're touring the U.S. What's going on with those?
Yeah, so those are the ones that Alemany starts working on with Dalí. So about 1949, it starts this almost 2-decade process of doing a couple each year. And by 1953, there are 20 of these that they've produced, and it's the Eye of Time, the lip pin that you have. Some of these wonderful examples, these are created already, and they're one of a kind. And Catherwood actually purchases 20 of them for, I believe it was around $50,000. And these start to be travel across the United States to different places like Bryn Mawr and Yale and other places as through the foundation as money-making opportunities for different charitable causes. And this continues all the way until, I believe, from 1953 to about 1960. And then the Owen Cheatham Foundation purchases those and continues to acquire new ones. And so by the mid-60s, they're doing the same thing. They're also traveling the same collection, which is now expanded. And finally, in I think it was late 1960s, they wind up in Richmond, Virginia, where they're left on deposit until 1980. So for a number of people, they saw them in Richmond, Virginia, this entire collection of about, at this point, 35, 34 objects. And this is the time when the Morses are interested in collecting these. So about the mid-1950s when Catherwood owned them and was traveling the collection.
And today, if somebody wants to see that collection, where are they held?
Yeah, so finally in the 1980, I believe in 1980, Virginia wasn't able to raise enough money to purchase it because it had really become quite expensive. So it was purchased by first a Saudi collector, then a Japanese collector, and then finally in 1999 it was all of the collection, 39 objects and many designs by Dalí were purchased by the foundation, the Dalí Teatro Museo Dalí in Figueres, Spain, which has built an extraordinary and beautiful annex to their museum, which houses the entire collection that Dalí designed. And they're extraordinary, and they produced this book that we have here in the foreground, which really amplifies how absolutely lovely and exquisite and imaginative, Dalí's ideas were.
Well, cool. Let's take a closer look then. So you've brought a few of these jewels with you today. What do you have with us? Let's get a closer.
Yeah, so let's see. We have 4 objects.
We've got to put our gloves
Gotta put the
on.
gloves on. Thank you. Thank you.
See if I can move.
This is perhaps the most, let's see, these will not fit me. I cannot wear the gloves. I will point to things, and perhaps if we need to move them, I'll have you do it.
Okay, I'll put my gloves on.
I cannot wear medium gloves, sadly. But we do have 4 examples of pieces that the Morses were able to acquire in the mid-50s, and they're really quite beautiful, and they were worn. She loved wearing the pieces whenever they would go to an elegant dinner, an elegant opening, a night at the opera. Eleanor Morse was very proud of these objects. And let's see. So, John, when you are able to focus, maybe the first one.
I'm looking at the telephone.
Yeah, the telephone pin. So the telephone pin relates to another pin that Dalí designed, which was actually also a pair of earrings. And those had emeralds and jade. Emeralds and rubies as the 2 points, and then a number of diamonds. So this is a more approachable, much more friendly version of this. It was $350, $380 in 1954, I believe. So right about that mid-period of time. And it is gold. It would have been a lower level of of the gems and of the material, but it was still done by Dalínian and Company, and they actually had 2, not 1, but 2 employees who had formerly been with Fabergé. So that consistency of craftsmanship was a really big part of it, and I think it's part of what the Morses really admired about these jewels.
And so this telephone too, I mean, that fits in a little bit with this idea that you were talking about of uselessness, because we're all familiar with his Lobster Telephone and this idea of a telephone that you can't really talk into, that doesn't serve its purpose.
Exactly. Yeah. So it points out its own uselessness in a perfect way. And it was, a lot of these ideas were also coming to Dalí in the late 30s when he was working with both Coco Chanel and Elsa Schiaparelli. He brought these ideas of uselessness, taking something very familiar and then suddenly repositioning it so it suddenly served no purpose at all.
Yeah, and so speaking of objects or symbols that we're accustomed to seeing in Dalí's work, this one is also obviously very familiar to people who know Dalí's work. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this jewel?
Yeah, so that's the persistence of memory pin, and it's more like a brooch. It's a rather large piece. The original one was even larger, And in the original one, there was actually, right underneath Dalí's signature, there was a door that would open, and there was a real timepiece that was also included in it. So it was a useless watch that had a useful watch buried within, hidden within it. So buried in secret compartments. And you can see that that this one, I think, was somewhere around $500 when the Morses purchased it. No, I'm sorry. It was over 1,000, so it was about 1,100. But it was something, I'm sure it was the prize for them. You know, of all the pieces they had, I think that was probably the one that got worn the most.
And now, one piece that people might be less familiar with is this one here at the front. So what is this piece?
So that one is referred to as Tristan and Isolde, and it's a pin that basically reconfigures and reimagines a very classic illusion. You have two faces exactly the same, pointing into one another, and the negative space that they create becomes a goblet. So it's called the hidden goblet illusion. And Dalí just turns the goblet into an actual goblet with the diamonds at the very top of it and the ruby to suggest wine. And Tristan and Isolde goes back to classical mythology and the idea of the quintessential love affair in some strange way. But it was something that resonated with him, and he even did a ballet around Tristan and Isolde. So
Yeah, this is just gorgeous. And, even though we're talking about the fact that these are not the actual jewels that were made with alimony, but they're copies, all of these things that we can see here, these are all diamonds. These are all real diamonds.
and they are done by the same people who built the original, one-of-a-kind jewels, so that there's a real consistency. And for a while, I was under the impression that perhaps others acquired similar ones through alimony. I don't think that's the case. It seems like the Morses really, through their interest in Dalí, pursued Alimony and Company to have these made. I don't think there are others that have them. I always thought maybe you would go into Alimony and Company and there'd be a couple of these on the shelf, but I don't think that's the case. I think these really were lower versions, but one-of-a-kind versions. of what they
Bespoke.
loved.
Okay, yeah.
And then
Beautiful.
there's a really nice transition. So that one is the classic illusion of metamorphosis, where something appears and disappears, the goblet or the faces. This Tree of Life set in the background is truly about metamorphosis. It's about the idea of Apollo and Daphne and the idea of the transformation into nature. And so here we have nature transformed into jewelry, where all of these have to do with the leaves on the tree. And what I always find really intriguing is this is a very, very small necklace. Eleanor Morse was a very petite woman, but I can't imagine that fit comfortably. I guess it did, but it just seems like she is even smaller than we remember, because it just seems like such a small and, I would assume, rather painful piece to wear, because all those are somewhat sharp edges. They would certainly start to itch over time, I would think.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have the earrings and the bracelet, and then, of course, the necklace.
Yeah, no, beautiful. Now, obviously, we have a lot of these really cool pieces, but what is missing from our collection? I believe that I remember a story that someone told me about a piece that they wanted, but that they couldn't get made.
Yeah, so sadly, and obviously, the Morses could not afford to purchase those one-of-a-kind pieces. There may have even been a contract with the Owen Cheatham collection after a certain point that they were done exclusively for them. But Reynolds Morse was really, really obsessed and fascinated with a piece called the heart. The ruby heart, and the ruby heart was created in such a way. I don't know if we can show this. Maybe this will work. But it's essentially
Yeah, if you
a
bring it
big.
over here a little bit and prop it up.
Okay. Try not too much.
Yeah, that's good.
That
That's
gonna work?
great. Yeah.
So you're seeing a detail here, but there's actually a huge crusted gold heart that looks like a big chunk of heart, and it has what looks like a royal.
Just
What do you-
tip it toward this way. There we go. Getting rid of
Okay.
the glare there. Yeah.
the royal jewels, from London.
The crown jewels.
Right. So those were
what inspired this piece. But what's really intriguing about it, and what actually a number of these pieces had, this piece had a movable part. And that's inside of the sort of tabernacle gold heart. There's a tiny ruby heart that looks like a real human heart. It's put together with a kind of mesh of gold, and there was actually a wind-up mechanism inside of it that would cause it to look like it was pulsing and beating like a human heart. So there's something both really intriguing and sort of ghastly about it, and I think that that was what delighted Dalí the most. Reynolds Morse really was intrigued by this piece and wanted to have a version of it in his collection. They kept talking to Alemany and Company. I think they were really close to make one, and then finally I think the Owen Cheatham family said they really did not want another one of these to exist, that they wanted to have the one and only. And so even though the Morses were finally ready to pay for a very expensive version, it wasn't allowed, so the copyright didn't, prohibited it from happening, which is very sad because I've got to say it's one of the most intriguing objects Dalí created.
Well, I think the really cool thing to me about all of these jewels, both the ones that are here in our collection and even the ones that didn't get made, is that despite the fact that he's working in a completely different medium, they're very consistent with the kinds of things that interested him throughout his career. This concept of, necessarily uselessness, or the fact that you take an inanimate object and you make it animate, you confuse reality and illusion. I mean, all of these things are just so Dalínian.
They are, even, and sort of the idea of taking something that seems beautiful in one context and then turning it into something that's sort of ghastly, or taking a really bad pun like a ruby lip with teeth of pearls and turning it, the cliche, into a kind of exquisite and really fun object. That's like quintessential to the whole approach to jewelry for Dalí.
Well, that's awesome. This has been incredibly interesting. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation. This is a lot of fun, and I think now I do have to do a talk at some point in the future, bring together a few more of the objects to share, because I think just people love this part of Dalí's work.
Oh, for sure. I think it'd be fascinating. So I want to thank the viewers for joining us today for this episode of Follow the Tangent, and be sure to catch us again in August. We'll be here on August 26th. Until then.